Climate-related weather events are driving up business costs, health risks, and insurance premiums, pushing climate change into executives' top 3 priorities. And to discuss this today, we are joined by Professor Lawrence Loh from the NUS Business School and Kamal Seth from WWF Singapore. Lawrence, if I can invite you into the discussion first, what are the main cost drivers of climate-related weather events for businesses?
If you look at business cost drivers, I think the main one are those that are related to risk. In fact, there are 2 categories of risk, physical risk as well as transition risk. If you look at the physical risk, of course, these are direct risks related to climate change. This could be changes in the weather patterns, rainfall, extreme heat, and these are the ones that will directly impact on the business operations. But the other type of risk, transition risk, are the ones that may be the cost drivers in the sense that companies, businesses will have to prepare to the incoming changes. For example, those induced by changes in regulation, changes in the markets, including investors' market, as well as the consumer markets.
If you look at the range of it, just to give you some numbers to begin with, in the year 2022, the cost of the natural disasters economically was $275 billion US dollars, out of which $125 billion was not even insured. And we are not even talking about the losses which are non-monetary towards people and nature. So we are living in a world in which the frequency of natural disasters are increasing, or extreme weather conditions are increasing. And it puts a lot of pressure on the companies which operate in this vulnerable environment. So give you some examples, the cost of insurance is going up because of the uncertainties on the assets that need to be insured. The cost of procuring raw materials is going up as well because of extreme weather conditions. For businesses which are mostly dependent on natural resources, so think of agri-food or think of seafood and the companies that supply seafood around the world. So they are very vulnerable to the extreme weather conditions that we are looking at. And that's the world that we live in as we speak. So higher insurance cost, higher cost of procurement of raw materials, higher cost of even raising capital, because as much as financial institutions want to provide green finance products, it's very difficult to do so in the world that we live in right now. So there's a lot to be done.
What operational disruptions do you feel are companies experiencing due to climate change?
I think if you look at businesses, of course, it might affect anywhere in their value chain, which includes the supply chain, the suppliers, or even the customer chain, which include how consumers or customers use their product. So in other words, it is something that would be across the entire spectrum of activities of the organization. But specifically, some of the parts of the value chain may be more exposed, particularly, for example, say logistics and distribution. If there are certain changes in climate or extreme weather conditions induced by climate change, there may be disruption in the flow of materials to the organization. And of course, this also relates to the company distribution to their consumers. So I think this is actually one of the most fundamental disruption that might actually impede the smooth flow of the business.
So think of coffee, cacao, palm, rubber, pulp and paper, timber. So all these natural resources that become raw materials for these companies might be disrupted because of extreme weather conditions and the world that we are living in today. The other is also the physical damage to the assets, especially in the coastal areas. Think of power generations and how those coastal communities and the assets that businesses have could be affected in the presence of wildfires, storms, hurricanes, floods, which are more and more frequent. So every flood is getting more severe than before, and every hurricane is becoming more severe than before. So those are the disruptions that are already happening. And if we don't find sufficient solutions for climate mitigation and adaptations, these situations will be worse in the future.
Well, thank you both very much. You both raised some very interesting points. I'd like to talk about regulatory frameworks. What industries, Lawrence, in your opinion, are most impacted by climate-related regulatory pressures?
I think, of course, if you look at industries that are most affected, Mostly they are those that are front-facing. In other words, they are actually at the mercy of the climate or even weather. So, for example, if you look at, say, construction, transportation, agriculture, these are obviously those sectors that are very vulnerable. But we cannot, ignore another sector which will have a secondary relationship with climate change. This is the finance sector. Finance sometimes may not be directly exposed, but in their product portfolio, in their financing, including some of the things that they provide money for, many of them are actually vulnerable to climate change. So in other words, there's a second order effect, a derived effect for the finance sector as well.
So some of the governments have been more progressive around it, and they have already deployed mechanisms like the carbon tax, like Singapore. In the EU's case, it's called the Carbon Borders Adjustment Mechanism, which asks the importers to compensate for any goods that they're importing in the EU market, which are linked to any negative impact like deforestation or greenhouse gas emissions. So I think some of the regions or the countries we are seeing are more progressive. From a regulatory perspective, this is just the beginning of this long journey in which our hope is that more and more governments realize the risk and the necessity to come up with regulations. And that obviously is a challenge for businesses because in many cases, it increases your cost of procurement, production, or business operations in general. So it's just the beginning. More and more countries and regions are going in that direction of carbon tax or carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And we can expect that in the coming years, more governments will be keen or required to come up with such regulations, which will create the challenge for businesses to comply with those norms.
Well, thank you both for sharing your insights with our viewers today, Lawrence and Kamal.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
Thank you.
Again, our guests were Professor Lawrence Lowe from the Department of Strategy and Policy at NUS Business School and Kamal Seth, Director of Climate and Sustainability at WWF Singapore. For more news, please visit esgbusiness.com.